Montana Territory, August 1879. The wind carried dust across the dry yard of the Fletcher Ranch as 32-year-old Holden Fletcher stood in the doorway of his barn, staring out at the parched fields and the two children playing in the dirt near the fence. His shirt clung to his back, soaked through from work and heat. Behind him, the empty house waited, still too quiet. His wife, Clara, had been buried under the cottonwood tree 2 months ago. Fever took her fast 3 days from cough to coffin. Now it was just him, his 6-year-old son Boyd, and his 4-year-old daughter Betsy. And none of them knew what to do with each other. Holden wiped his hands on his trousers and called out, "Boyd, get your sister out of the sun." Boyd looked up, squinting. "She ain't hot." "But you are," Holden said. His voice came out rougher than he meant. "Go on." The boy took Betsy's hand, and they shuffled toward the house. Holden stayed back, his chest tight. He could mend fences, break horses, and shoot straight at half a mile. But getting his children through the day without Clara? That felt like trying to rope the wind. That night, he burned potatoes again and barely touched his plate. Betsy cried when she could not find the red ribbon her mother had braided into her hair. Boyd just stared at the wall. The next morning, Holden rode into town. He needed supplies and maybe someone who could help with the children. Just for a little while. He tied his horse outside the general store in Willow Creek, a stretch of buildings barely clinging to the edge of the prairie. The church bell rang the hour. It was nearly empty, save for a tall woman at the counter, her back to him, speaking to the clerk. She wore a pale blue dress and carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that was hard to miss. Her brown hair was tied back neat under a straw bonnet. The voice that floated back to him was soft but clear. "I can read and write, sew, cook and tend to children. I do not need much, just a place to earn my keep." The clerk, Mr. Elson, gave a shrug. "Families out here are thin as nails, Miss Willa. Most are barely feeding their own." Holden stepped closer before he could talk himself out of it. "You said you can care for children?" Willa turned. Her eyes were gray-blue and steady. She looked at him, really looked, not past or through. "I can," she said. "I lost my wife, just this June." The words scraped coming out. "I have 2 young ones, a boy and a girl. I work sun up to dark, and they need more than I can give." Willa nodded once. "I am sorry for your loss. I cannot pay much." "I do not want much," she said. "Only a roof and work that matters." Holden studied her face, saw no pity there, only calm. "My place is 6 miles west. You would have your own room." "I can come today," she said. By dusk, she was sitting at Holden's table, slicing carrots into the pot while Boyd and Betsy watched her like she was made of lightning. She moved quiet, sure, but not stiff. She let Betsy hand her the salt, smiled when Boyd asked how long until supper. That night, Holden lay awake in the lean-to off the kitchen, listening to Betsy's soft breathing and Willa's footsteps in the next room. He exhaled into the dark. The house felt different already. In the morning, he found clean clothes laid out for the children and warm bread on the table. Willa stood by the stove, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She looked up at him. "I hope it is all right," she said. He nodded. "It is more than all right." Days passed, then weeks. Willa taught Betsy how to brush her hair without tangling it. She showed Boyd how to hold a pencil, how to write his name in straight lines. She never tried to fill Clara's space. She just made room for herself in the quiet corners. Holden watched from a distance, then a little closer. One afternoon, he came in early from the south pasture, his shirt damp with sweat. He found Willa and the children in the yard. She was kneeling in the grass, showing them how to plant beans in a wooden box she had found behind the barn. "Now," she said gently, "you press the seed down with your thumb, not too deep, just enough so it feels safe." Boyd did it, brows furrowed. Betsy copied with care. Willa looked up and caught Holden watching. "You grow anything before?" she asked. "Not much," he said, stepping closer. "Never had the time. Things take root when you give them a little care." Her voice was quiet, but the words hung heavy between them. That night, he stayed at the table after the children went to bed. Willa poured him coffee, sat across from him. The lamp cast a soft glow between them. She looked at him, her eyes steady. "I do not mean to overstep. You are not. I just want to help." "You are," he said, "more than you know." He did not say it, but in the pit of his tired chest, something had shifted. The house felt warmer. The children laughed more. And when Willa smiled at him, something in him wanted to stay in that moment a little longer. She touched the rim of her cup. "My folks died back in Iowa. Fever, too. I came west because I did not know where else to go. I did not think I would find anything like this." Holden nodded, throat tight. "Neither did I." Outside, the wind blew soft through the cottonwoods. Inside, two people who had lost everything sat a little closer than yesterday. Neither said the word for what was happening, but it was there in the way their eyes held, in the silence that did not need filling. And for the first time in a long while, Holden Fletcher did not feel so alone. September settled over the valley with cooler mornings and the hush of yellowing cottonwood leaves. Holden rose earlier now, not from habit but from something quieter, an urge to give his days shape again. Out past the barn, mist clung low to the ground. He moved fence posts by lantern light and listened to the faint sounds of the house waking behind him. Willa had taken to singing in the morning's low, tuneless melodies that never said much but softened the air. She didn't know he heard her. He never said he did. One afternoon, after mending a gate near the creek, Holden came up the hill to find Willa kneeling on the porch with a pail, scrubbing the children's boots. Boyd sat nearby, tying knots in a length of twine. Betsy hummed to herself over a piece of chalk, drawing on the boards. Willa didn't look up. "You keep letting that gate sag. It's going to break clean off." Holden leaned against the post. "Figured I'd wait until it did, then save the trouble." She glanced up then, eyes catching his. "That's not very forward thinking." "I never claimed to be." Willa smiled small, just once, and turned back to her work. The sun caught in her hair, and he found himself watching the steady movement of her hands. She handled everything like it was worth something. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Holden brought in the broken clock from the mantel. It had belonged to Clara's father, but it hadn't ticked right in years. He set it on the table between them. "I've taken it apart before," he said, "but I never got it to run again." Willa examined it quietly, then opened the back panel and peered inside. "The spring's too tight. You've got the balance pinched." She reached for a small knife from her apron pocket and adjusted the metal just so. "Try it now." Holden wound it. The second hand stirred, then caught rhythm. He looked at her. "You always know how to fix things?" "No," she said, still watching the clock. "But I pay attention." They sat across from each other while the clock ticked between them, the sound filling the quiet in a way neither of them needed to interrupt. Later that week, Willa asked Holden if she could take the children to the riverbank past the ridge. "They've been inside too long," she said. "Fresh air does more than food sometimes." Holden hesitated. "That far? I'll tie a red kerchief to the elm if we go. You'll see it from the south field." He nodded. "All right, just be back before dusk." She packed bread and apples in a basket and led the children past the fence, over the rise where the wind shifted. Holden watched them go, the hem of her skirt lifting with each step, Betsy's hand curled in hers. By late afternoon, when he rode in from the west pasture, the kerchief fluttered bright against the tree. He set the horse to a trot and followed the trail. He found them near the bend of the creek, Willa with her sleeves rolled, helping Boyd stack smooth stones into a wall. Betsy stood ankle-deep in the water, holding a twig like a fishing pole. "You're just in time," Willa said as Holden dismounted. "We're building a fort." "Is that so?" he asked, crouching beside Boyd. "Looks more like a dam." "Depends what side you're on," Willa said. Holden looked at her, the way the light touched her face, the laugh barely held in her throat. He reached down and placed a stone beside Boyd's. "Then I guess I'm on your side." They stayed until the shadows lengthened and the air cooled. On the walk back, Betsy rode on Holden's shoulders, her small hands wrapped in his shirt. Boyd wandered ahead, stick in hand, narrating some adventure. Willa walked beside Holden in silence, their steps falling into rhythm. At the porch, Holden paused before opening the door. "I was thinking of adding another room, off the back. Could be a school space for the children." He hesitated. "Or something you might use." Willa didn't answer right away. "Then, that'd be good." He cleared his throat. "If you have thoughts about how it should be laid out, I'd like to hear them." She looked at him, steady and quiet. "You asking because it's my work? Or because I'm staying?" "Both." Her gaze softened, and she nodded once. "Then I'll draw you something." That night, long after the children were asleep, Holden stood outside under the stars. The windows of the house glowed behind him. He felt the weight of the earth under his boots, but less of the weight in his chest. Inside, Willa had left a folded page on the table, lines sketched in pencil, careful and clear. A room with windows facing east. A square table in the center. Shelves along one wall. And in the corner a rocking chair. Not labeled but drawn with care. He didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But he knew what it felt like. And for the first time since the grave had settled behind the cottonwood, he wanted to build something again. October brought frost that clung to the porch railings and turned the morning air sharp. The horses breathed in plumes, and the ground crackled under boots before the sun had time to soften it. Holden moved slower in the cold, but he took to his work steadier now, without the tight pull in his chest that used to greet each day. He was laying cedar boards behind the house, the start of the new room, when Willa came out carrying a small tin of nails. He hadn't asked her to help, but she brought them anyway, a wool shawl around her shoulders and a pencil tucked behind her ear. "I measured the corner wrong," he said, squinting at the frame. "It's off by near half an inch." Willa knelt beside the beam and ran her fingers along it. "You can see where the grain split. If you shift it from the base, it'll fall into line." Holden watched her hands, then nodded and adjusted the board. It settled with a soft creak. "You ever build anything besides chicken coops and shelves?" he asked. "My uncle taught me to frame a window when I was 13, she said. "He said a woman ought to know how to keep the weather out, just in case the menfolk wandered off." Holden looked at her face, brushed with wind, and for the first time thought to ask something he hadn't before. "You ever want a place of your own?" Her eyes flicked up. "I used to think of it. But I stopped building houses in my mind a long time ago." He didn't press. She passed him the tin, and he took it without another word. But he didn't stop thinking about it. That evening, after the children were asleep, Willa sat by the hearth with a square of muslin stretched on a hoop. She stitched with small, even movements, knees drawn close under her skirt. Holden sat across from her, sharpening the edge of his drawknife, but his eyes kept drifting back to the thread moving through her fingers. "You sew names into that?" he asked. "No," she said, "just patterns. Things I remember." "From Iowa?" She nodded once, not looking up. "The corner of the quilt my mother made. The way the fence slanted toward the orchard. I keep them in my hands so they don't leave my head." Holden set the knife down. Is that how you keep from forgetting? She looked up at him then, and her voice was quiet. Some memories get heavy if you leave them alone too long. Better to let them move through something. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I never knew what to do with mine, the ones from after. Maybe you don't have to do anything, she said. Maybe they just need a place to sit. The fire popped, and the silence stretched long. But it didn't feel empty. The next day, Holden took the wagon into town for feed and winter salt. He left Boyd and Betsy with Willa, after she insisted she could manage them just fine. By the time he returned, the smell of apples and cinnamon filled the house, and Betsy had red sugar on her cheeks. She's never sat that still, he said after the children had gone to bed. What did you bribe her with? I told her the pie would taste sweeter if she helped make it. And that worked. Willa lifted her chin, a ghost of pride in her voice. She pressed the edge of the crust all by herself. Then Boyd wanted to try. Holden leaned against the doorframe, watching her stack kindling beside the stove. They're different around you. They're just steadying their feet again, she said. Same as you. He stepped closer. You think I'm steady? I think you're learning how to be. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his chest that he didn't fight. The following week, a storm rolled in from the north. The wind carried sleet, and the horses grew restless in the barn. Holden spent half a night reinforcing the roof, while Willa kept water warm on the stove and dried the children's hands when they came in from helping stack wood. When the wind hit hardest, the four of them sat together in the front room. Boyd rested his head against Willa's side, and Betsy curled up in Holden's lap, already half asleep. Willa's hand moved gently through Boyd's hair as she hummed low, the same quiet melody she used when wiping down the table or tying her apron strings. Holden looked across the room at her, their eyes meeting over the children's heads. No words passed between them, but something steady and certain settled in the space between. That night, after the storm passed and the house fell into stillness again, Holden lingered at the threshold of Willa's room. Her lamp was still burning low. I wanted to ask you something, he said. She turned from where she was folding a blanket. Would you want to stay? He said. Not just through winter, not just for the children, but for yourself? For us? Willa didn't answer right away. She set the blanket aside and crossed the small room until she stood in front of him. Her voice was quiet, but sure. I would. Holden reached for her hand, rough palm to palm. She didn't pull away. Outside, frost slicked the fence rails silver. Inside, something warmer rooted deeper than comfort. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't new. It was simply right. And for the first time in longer than he could name, Holden Fletcher let the weight he carried settle into something shared. The first snow came quiet, dusting the fence rails and the roofline with white that caught the morning light like sifted flour. It didn't stay, not yet, but it was enough to remind them what lay ahead. Willa folded the curtains back from the windows that morning and stood watching the light settle across the yard, her breath faint in the glass. Holden came in from the barn, pulling off his gloves. Mules favoring his left leg. I'll ride him light for a few days. Willa turned from the window. I can soak a wrap with vinegar and mustard seed. My uncle used it on a gelding once, kept the swelling down. I'll fetch the vinegar, Holden said, already setting his gloves down. That afternoon, while Boyd practiced reading aloud from a primer Willa had traded for in town, Betsy sat at her feet threading dried berries onto a string. Willa's hands moved in rhythm with her thoughts, darning a hole in one of Holden's winter shirts. The quiet in the room wasn't heavy, it carried the feel of something lived in, something earned. Why do you do that one stitch at a time? Boyd asked, his thumb tracing the page of his book. Because if I rush, I'll miss where it's thin, Willa said without looking up. Same with reading. You go too fast, you won't see what the sentence is really saying. Boyd nodded solemnly and read slower. Holden passed the doorway just then, his eyes grazing the scene inside. He didn't speak, but his steps faltered, and he lingered a moment longer before continuing out to the woodpile. That evening, Willa stepped outside with a basin of scraps for the chickens. The air had dropped low enough that her breath came in wisps. She paused on the porch, listening. The sound of Holden splitting wood was steady and even, the axe cracking through the cold like a heartbeat. She walked toward him, her boots crunching over stiff earth. "You'll wear your shoulder out before supper." "I'll be fine," he said, setting the next log in place. "You ever split wood?" "Only when I had to. My swing's crooked." "Show me." She laughed once, low. "You want me to prove I'm worse at it than you?" Holden handed her the axe. "I'll spot you." She took it, adjusting her grip. Her swing landed off-center, biting the edge of the log without splitting it. "That's what I meant," she said, handing it back. "I can patch a roof and gut a fish, but I've never managed to split a log straight." Holden looked at her hands. "You do plenty." She met his eyes. "So do you." That night, Holden found her out by the fire after the children had gone to bed. She sat with a folded towel in her lap, mending a tear in Betsy's winter coat. The fire cast gold across the floor, catching the curve of her cheek. He sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth from her side. "You planning to stay with us through spring?" She didn't answer right away. "I've thought on it." He watched her fingers pause over a stitch. "Nothing's held me anywhere in years," she said. "Not since I left home. I've moved from town to town, never more than a season. But this place, it doesn't feel like somewhere I'm passing through." His voice was quiet. "I'd like you to stay." Willa looked at him then, not startled, not uncertain. "I want to," she said. Holden leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't need to give me an answer tonight. I just wanted to say it plain." Willa set the coat aside and folded her hands in her lap. "I already have." He turned toward her. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Holden reached for her hand, slow and certain. She let him, their fingers fitting without ceremony. The wind picked up outside, rattling the bare branches against the window panes. Inside, the fire burned steady, the house quiet around them. The children slept under quilts upstairs. The kitchen was swept clean, and no part of Holden's heart felt alone anymore. He looked at Willa beside him, her hand in his, and saw not a helper, not a guest, but a woman who had taken up the empty corners of their lives with grace and steadiness. And he, a man who once thought all the good had been buried under a cottonwood, now knew better. He had not forgotten Clara. He never would. But love had come again, not to replace what was lost, but to grow beside it. And this time, it came quiet and slow, like snow settling over the land, certain, lasting. He didn't speak it aloud. Neither did she. But the warmth between their joined hands said everything. By mid-November, the days shortened enough that dusk came before supper. The new room behind the house stood framed and roofed, with the windows Willa had drawn placed where the light touched earliest. Holden had built the walls by hand, but the shape of the space had come from her, and that made it mean more than timber or nails. One afternoon, after the last board had been planed and set, Holden laid down his tools and stepped back. Willa stood just inside the doorway, her palm resting against the sill. The glass hadn't yet been fitted, but wind moved through the frame like it belonged there. "I thought we'd use this room for the children's lessons," he said. "But there's space enough for more, if you ever wanted to take in others." Willa folded her arms loosely. "Children, outlying families might send them. Some don't have a schoolhouse nearer than 30 miles. She turned to him slowly. "You'd be all right with that?" "I'd like it," he said. "It's yours to fill." Her expression stayed unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded once, not with surprise, but with quiet resolve, as if she'd been waiting to hear the words spoken aloud. "I've thought about teaching again. Not just reading and numbers. Things that help a person hold steady. Sewing, herbs, how to clean a wound without flinching. You think that's something they'd want to learn? They might not know it yet, but they will." Holden stepped inside, his boots brushing with shavings beneath them. "I've got extra plank. I could build a bench along the back. Make it wide enough to sit 3 across," Willa said. "You never know who might show up." They stood in the unfinished room as the wind moved around them, and the future settled without ceremony. Later that week, Willa rode into Willow Creek with Holden and the children, the wagon loaded with trade goods from the shed. She wore her winter shawl pinned at the collar, a pair of worn gloves Holden had restitched at the seams. Boyd sat beside her on the bench, his feet dangling, while Betsy clutched a cloth doll Willa had helped her sew from scraps. The town had changed little since summer, but the way they moved through it had. Elsa nodded as they passed, and the shopkeeper's wife brought out 2 jars of preserved peaches without needing to be asked. Inside the mercantile, Willa studied a bundle of slates and chalk. Holden stood beside her, arms crossed. "You think they'll last?" he asked. "Children wear things out," she said. "That's how you know they're learning." He watched her thumb the edge of a slate. "Buy as many as you need." She glanced up. "You're sure?" "Willa." He said her name like it was steady ground. "You're not borrowing this life. It's yours." She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once and placed the slates on the counter. That night, after the children were asleep, Holden brought in a box he'd carried back from the wagon. He set it on the table in front of Willa without saying anything. She untied the twine and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in linen, was a cast-iron kettle, newer than anything in the house. She touched the handle, then looked up at him. "It's for the new stove in your room," Holden said. "Figured if you're going to be teaching, you'll want tea ready for sore throats and cold mornings." She said nothing for a long moment. Then, softly, "No one's ever bought me something just because they thought I'd need it." Holden sat across from her. "I've never thought ahead for anyone but the children. Until you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of all the things they hadn't said, and no longer needed to. He reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers curled into his like they belonged there. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "Not for the house or the children or the work. Just because it's you." Willa's eyes didn't fill, but they softened in a way that felt as true. "I'd like that too." They were married 2 weeks later, in a quiet ceremony beneath the cottonwoods. The preacher came from a town east of the ridge, and the neighbors gathered with simple gifts: handmade linens, a basket of eggs, a carved wooden spoon. Betsy wore a dress Willa had sewn from pale blue muslin, and Boyd stood beside Holden with his shirt tucked straight and his hair combed for once. Afterward, Willa and Holden stood near the root of the tree where Clara lay buried. Willa knelt and placed a single sprig of winter sage at the base of the headstone. She didn't speak, but her hand rested on Holden's as she stood again. He looked down once, then back at her. "She'd want them to be loved," he said. "You already do." Willa nodded. "I'll keep doing it." Winter settled in earnest after that. Snow came deeper, but the house held warm. The new room filled with soft light and the sound of chalk against slate. Willa taught 6 children from nearby homesteads, and kept a tin of horehound drops in her apron pocket for sore throats. Holden built a second bench along the north wall and mended boots in the evenings. He always left one lamp burning in the main room, just in case Willa was up late reading. The children flourished. Boyd read aloud with confidence now, and Betsy could count to 30 without losing her place. At night, they climbed into bed without asking for their mother, not because they'd forgotten, but because they no longer felt alone. Willa and Holden slept in the same room, beneath a quilt she'd pieced together from old shirts and curtain scraps. Some mornings he'd wake first and watch her sleep, her hair loose across the pillow and one hand curled near her face. He'd never known peace could feel so simple. They lived that way for many years. Holden planted an orchard to the south of the house, and Willa taught children until her hair silvered at the edges. Boyd grew tall and steady, and left one spring to help build a railroad grade in Idaho. Betsy stayed longer, then married a quiet boy from the northern range and brought her own daughter to sit at Willa's table, learning to press seeds into the earth. Holden and Willa grew old together, not quickly, but in the way seasons pass when you're paying attention. Their love didn't fade or falter. It deepened, like roots finding water beneath hard ground. And on the porch each evening, as the sun dipped low behind the cottonwoods, they sat close enough to touch but rarely needed to. Their hands found each other without searching. And they were happy, forever and always.